British television spent decades building an entire class of national treasures, faces so familiar they felt like extended family sitting in your living room every Saturday night. Game show hosts, sitcom stars, comedians who filled the top of the ratings for years on end. What rarely got mentioned on the way up was what happened once the cameras stopped rolling and the phone stopped ringing. Some of these people lost their money to bad management or their own bad habits. Others lost their health, their families, or simply their place in an industry that moves on the second you stop being useful to it. A few lost all of it at once. If you've ever wondered what really happened to the household names of British telly once the lights went down, this one's for you. And if stories like this are your thing, the subscribe button is right there whenever you're ready. Number 20. Anthia Redern. For a stretch of the 1970s, Anthia Redern was one of the most recognizable women on British television, the glamorous hostess turning letters and revealing prizes alongside Bruce Forsyth on The Generation Game. She wasn't just a presenter, she was married to Forsyth himself, and the show turned her into a genuine national figure almost overnight, with her catchphrase moment spinning around to reveal the show's famous cuddly toy, becoming one of the most repeated bits on British television. When her marriage to Forsyth ended in 1979, her position on the show ended not long after, and the industry that had built an entire persona around her as half of a beloved television couple simply stopped calling once that couple no longer existed. Work became sporadic. She took smaller presenting jobs and public appearances, but nothing close to the level of exposure she'd had at her peak, and for years afterward she largely stepped out of public life altogether, declining most interview requests about her career or her marriage. It's a story that says something uncomfortable about how British television treated women who were famous primarily through association with a bigger name. Once the association ended, so did the career, regardless of how much of the show's popularity she'd actually been responsible for. Number 19. Russ Conway. In the late 1950s, Russ Conway was one of the biggest entertainers in Britain, a pianist whose easy, cheerful style made him a fixture on television variety programs and a genuine chart-topping recording artist, racking up multiple number-one hits and regular appearances that made his face as familiar as his music. Behind the relentlessly upbeat public image, Conway was dealing with serious mental health struggles that the entertainment industry of the era had absolutely no framework for handling. He suffered a series of nervous breakdowns through the 1960s, several serious enough to require hospitalization, at a time when discussing mental illness publicly, let alone as a beloved television entertainer, simply wasn't something the industry or the press knew how to do with any sensitivity. Each collapse pulled him further from the spotlight, and bookings that had once been guaranteed started drying up as program controllers grew wary of an act they saw as unpredictable rather than unwell. He kept performing when he could, doing smaller venues and occasional television spots well into later decades, but he never came close to reclaiming the level of fame he'd had at his commercial peak. Conway's story is one of the clearer examples of how British entertainment in that era handled a performer's health problems, not with support but with quiet distance until the offers stopped coming altogether. Number 18. Dorothy Squires. Dorothy Squires spent decades as one of Britain's most powerful and most litigious entertainers, a singer and stage performer who transitioned into television variety work and became known almost as much for her legal battles as her actual performances. At her commercial peak in the 1950s and 60s, she was earning serious money and living in genuine luxury, but Squires had an almost compulsive habit of pursuing legal action against anyone she felt had wronged her, reportedly filing dozens of lawsuits over her career against newspapers, business associates, and former colleagues. The legal fees alone were ruinous, and combined with a lifestyle that never scaled back even as her bookings declined through the 1970s and 80s, her finances collapsed entirely. In 1985, she was declared bankrupt, and matters got dramatically worse from there. In 1994, she was formally evicted from her home after falling seriously behind on payments, a story that made national headlines given how far she'd fallen from her earlier fame. By the final years of her life, she was living in modest rented accommodation in Wales, largely dependent on a small circle of loyal friends and fellow performers who organized benefit concerts to help cover her costs. She died in 1998, remembered by the industry less for her considerable talent than for the astonishing scale of her financial and legal collapse. Number 17. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams was one of the most instantly recognizable voices in British comedy, a carry-on regular and a fixture on radio and chat show couches for decades. Famous for a wit so sharp it made him one of the most quoted diarists and interviewees of his generation. Unlike a lot of names on this list, Williams wasn't short of money. His financial situation stayed relatively stable throughout his life. What he lost was almost everything else. His private diaries, published after his death, reveal a man dealing with profound loneliness, chronic health complaints that were partly psychosomatic, and a deep, unresolved unhappiness that his public persona never let on to audiences who saw only the razor-sharp comic timing. He never married, kept even close friends at a careful emotional distance, and by his own written account spent much of his life feeling fundamentally disconnected from the people around him despite constant public adoration. In 1988, he was found dead at his London flat from an overdose of barbiturates, and while the coroner recorded an open verdict, the diary entry found from the night before, expressing exhaustion with his own existence, has led most biographers to treat his death as almost certainly intentional. Williams is a reminder that losing everything doesn't always mean losing your money. Sometimes it means building a career on being endlessly entertaining to everyone except yourself. If any of these are surprising you so far, or if you grew up watching one of these names on telly and had no idea how things actually ended for them, drop a comment and tell me which one. There's a lot more still to get through. Number 16, Benny Hill. For years, Benny Hill was one of the most commercially successful entertainers Britain ever exported. His sketch show syndicated to dozens of countries and reportedly watched by more people worldwide than almost any other British television program of its era. In 1989, Thames Television abruptly cancelled his show, a decision widely attributed to changing tastes and growing discomfort with the style of comedy that had made him famous for decades. The cancellation devastated him professionally in a way his considerable personal wealth couldn't fix. He struggled to find new work, watched former protégés and cast members distance themselves publicly from the show that had made their careers too, and gradually withdrew from the industry and from most of his social circle. Hill had never married, lived relatively modestly despite his wealth, and by his final years was living largely alone in a small flat in Teddington, rarely seen in public and increasingly cut off from the entertainment world that had once made him one of its biggest names. In 1992, he died of a heart attack at home, and it was several days before anyone realized, his body eventually discovered by concerned neighbors and colleagues after he failed to respond to calls. He left an estate reportedly worth several £1,000,000, a strange final detail that makes his story less about financial ruin and more about a man who had every material comfort and somehow still ended up completely alone. Number 15, George Best. George Best built his fame on a football pitch, but by the 1970s he'd become just as much a television personality, a regular fixture on chat shows and football punditry programs whose charisma made him one of the most bookable faces in British broadcasting. His alcoholism, which had already begun affecting his playing career in his 20s, followed him fully into his television years and steadily destroyed both his earning power and his reputation. He was dropped from broadcasting commitments repeatedly due to appearances where he was visibly intoxicated on air, most infamously a widely replayed 1990 interview that became a symbol of exactly how far his decline had gone. Business ventures, including restaurants and clothing lines that traded on his name, collapsed one after another as his reliability continued to deteriorate. In 2002, he underwent a liver transplant, a procedure that briefly renewed public sympathy and interest in his story, but he was unable to stay away from alcohol even afterward, a relapse that severely damaged the transplanted organ. He died in 2005 from complications related to a lung infection compounded by his long-term alcohol abuse and its effect on his immune system, and his funeral drew an enormous public outpouring that stood in sharp contrast to how isolated and financially strained his final years had actually been. Number 14, Frank Bough. Frank Bough spent decades as one of the most trusted faces on British television, anchoring Grandstand and later Breakfast Time, with a reputation for calm, dependable professionalism that made him a genuine fixture of British mornings. In 1988, tabloid reports emerged detailing his involvement in cocaine use and visits to sadomasochism parties, allegations that Bough did not seriously dispute, and the fallout was immediate and total. The BBC dropped him from his flagship programs almost overnight, and an image built over 20 years of being the reassuring voice of British broadcasting collapsed in a matter of days once the story broke. He attempted to rebuild through smaller broadcasting roles over the following years, but nothing close to the level of trust and visibility he'd once had. The association with the scandal simply followed him everywhere he went professionally. He gradually withdrew from public life almost entirely, giving very few interviews in his later decades and living quietly out of the spotlight that had defined most of his adult life. Bough's story is a fairly stark illustration of how quickly British broadcasting could turn on a personality once their private life became a public liability, no matter how long or how successful their career had been up to that point. Number 13. Adam Faith. Adam Faith started as a pop star before transitioning into a genuinely respected acting and television career, most notably starring in the drama series Budgie, and later becoming a familiar face across British entertainment programming for decades. In the 1980s, Faith made a decision that would eventually cost him almost everything he'd built. He became a Lloyd's of London name, essentially an individual investor who takes on personal financial liability in exchange for a share of insurance profits. When Lloyd's was hit by a catastrophic series of losses in the early 1990s, driven by asbestos claims and natural disasters, Faith was left personally liable for enormous sums, reportedly losing the vast majority of the wealth he'd spent his career building. He was declared bankrupt in 1997, a genuinely humbling turn for a man who had been a major star for 3 decades. In a twist that says something about his resilience, Faith turned the disaster into a second career, becoming a financial journalist and writing about the very industry that had ruined him, developing real expertise on personal finance that he shared through newspaper columns and television appearances. He died in 2003 of a heart attack while appearing in a stage play, working right up until the end, still rebuilding a fortune he'd lost through a decision that had nothing to do with his actual talent. Number 12. Michael Barrymore. Through the 1990s, Michael Barrymore was one of the highest paid and most consistently popular entertainers on British television, hosting a string of major primetime shows that regularly pulled in some of the biggest audiences on ITV. In March 2001, a guest named Stuart Lubbock was found dead in the swimming pool at Barrymore's home following a party, and while Barrymore was never charged with any crime in connection with the death, the tabloid coverage and public speculation that followed effectively ended his mainstream television career overnight. Sponsors and broadcasters distanced themselves immediately, existing shows were pulled from schedules, and work that had once been guaranteed simply stopped arriving. Without his primary income source and facing enormous ongoing legal costs tied to the years of scrutiny that followed, his finances deteriorated steadily through the 2000s, and in 2011 he was formally declared bankrupt. He attempted various comeback efforts over the following years, including reality television appearances aimed at rehabilitating his public image, but nothing came close to restoring the career he'd had at his peak. Barrymore's story remains one of the clearest examples in British television history of how quickly proximity to a genuine tragedy, regardless of legal culpability, can permanently end a career that took decades to build. Number 11. Jim Davidson. Jim Davidson was one of the biggest names in British light entertainment through the 1980s and 90s, a comedian and game show host whose various television vehicles made him a fixture on primetime schedules for years. Behind the scenes, Davidson's finances were in a state of near-constant crisis, driven by a combination of expensive divorces, reportedly going through several over the course of his life, and business ventures that consistently failed to deliver. He was declared bankrupt multiple times across his career, a genuinely unusual pattern even among entertainers known for financial mismanagement, with reports periodically surfacing of significant unpaid tax bills and mounting personal debt. His comedic style, once mainstream enough to anchor primetime ITV programming, also grew increasingly out of step with changing British attitudes over the decades, making it progressively harder to secure the kind of major broadcasting deals that had defined his earlier career. In 2014, he faced a high-profile arrest and investigation connected to historical allegations, for which he was ultimately never charged. But the process itself further damaged his already fragile standing in an industry growing more cautious about controversy. He's continued working through smaller venues and touring stand-up shows well into his 70s, a far cry from the primetime dominance he once had, a career defined almost as much by its repeated financial collapses as by the fame that preceded each one. Number 10. Mike Yarwood. At his absolute peak in the mid-1970s, Mike Yarwood was arguably the single biggest entertainer on British television, an impressionist whose Christmas specials regularly pulled in audiences of over 20 million people, numbers that remain among the highest ever recorded for a British entertainment program. His impressions of politicians and public figures were so influential that some historians have credited them with genuinely shaping public perception of the people he was mimicking. Through the 1980s, his career began an unusually steep decline, partly because a shifting political and comedic landscape made his particular brand of gentle impressions feel increasingly dated, and partly because Yarwood himself was privately struggling with alcoholism and depression that made him progressively less reliable to work with. Bookings dried up through the decade, and by the 1990s, a man who had once commanded the biggest audiences in British broadcasting history was almost entirely absent from television. He lived quietly and modestly in his later years, largely out of the public eye, occasionally surfacing for interviews reflecting on a fame that had evaporated far faster than it had built. Yarwood died in 2023, and much of the coverage of his death focused on how few younger viewers had any idea just how enormous his career had once been. A strange kind of erasure for someone who briefly held the biggest audience British television has ever recorded. Number 9. Keith Chegwin. Keith Chegwin became a household name as a children's television presenter in the 1970s and 80s, most notably on Multicolored Swap Shop, his boundless energy making him one of the most recognizable faces to an entire generation of young British viewers. As that generation grew up, and the work that had defined his early career dried up, Chegwin struggled to transition into other kinds of presenting, and he began drinking heavily, a struggle he later discussed with real candor in interviews rather than trying to hide it. His career through the 1990s and 2000s became a fairly public cycle of comeback attempts and setbacks, including stints on reality television that were explicitly framed around his efforts to rebuild both his career and his sobriety. He did eventually achieve lasting recovery from alcohol later in life, a genuine turnaround that he spoke about openly as one of his proudest accomplishments. Health problems followed regardless, and in 2017 he died from a lung condition that had been affecting him for some time. Chegwin's story stands out on this list because it isn't purely one of loss. It's a story of someone who lost his career, very nearly lost his health entirely, and then spent his final years rebuilding what he could of both, with an honesty about his struggles that was fairly rare among entertainers of his generation. Number 8. Lena Zavaroni. Lena Zavaroni became a genuine phenomenon as a child, winning opportunity knocks and going on to host her own BBC variety show while still a teenager, her voice drawing comparisons to established adult stars twice her age. The pressures of that level of childhood fame, combined with an entertainment industry that had essentially no framework for protecting young performers from the demands placed on them, contributed to Zavaroni developing severe anorexia in her teenage years, a struggle that would define the rest of her life. Her career, once one of the most promising in British entertainment, was steadily overtaken by the severity of her illness, with repeated hospitalizations making sustained work increasingly difficult through her 20s and 30s. Financially, much of what she'd earned as a child star had been managed by adults around her, rather than protected in any structured way, leaving her with far less security than her early fame would suggest she should have had. In 1999, at just 35 years old, Zavaroni died following complications from a brain surgery that had been intended as a last resort treatment connected to her illness. Her story remains one of the starkest examples in British broadcasting history of an industry that built a career on a child's talent and offered almost nothing in the way of protection once that child grew into an adult struggling to survive what fame had done to her. If you've stuck with this one this far, I'd genuinely like to know in the comments which of these stories you'd actually heard before, because for most of these names, the public image and the real ending are almost nothing alike. Number 7. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe through the 1950s, a genuine glamour icon whose career spanned film, television, and eventually a string of chat show and panel appearances that kept her a familiar face for decades. Her financial life was consistently chaotic, marked by a series of business ventures that repeatedly failed, and a lifestyle that rarely scaled back to match her actual income at any given point. She faced serious financial difficulties multiple times through the 1960s and 70s, at one point reportedly close to bankruptcy, saved largely by continuing to take television work even when the roles were far smaller than the ones that had made her famous. Her fourth husband, actor Alan Lake, was separately convicted of fraud in the years surrounding her death, a case connected to attempts to profit from her estate and reputation that added a genuinely tragic postscript to her financial story. Dors was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 1982 and died in 1984, and Lake, reportedly unable to cope with the loss and his own mounting legal and financial troubles, took his own life the following year. What had once been one of the most glamorous names in British entertainment ended in a genuinely bleak tangle of debt, fraud charges, and 2 deaths within a year of each other. Number 6. Hughie Green. Hughie Green was one of the most powerful men in British television for a solid 2 decades, the host and creator of Opportunity Knocks, a talent show format so successful it essentially invented the modern British talent competition and made Green one of the highest paid and most influential broadcasters in the country. As his format aged and newer competitors began outperforming it through the 1970s, Green's career went into a steady decline that he reportedly struggled badly to accept, growing increasingly bitter and difficult to work with as the industry that had once revolved around him moved on to other hosts and other formats. He became increasingly reclusive through his later years, drinking heavily and largely withdrawing from the public life that had once defined him almost completely. After his death in 1997, one of the more genuinely startling posthumous revelations in British entertainment history emerged. DNA testing confirmed he was the biological father of broadcaster Paula Yates, a fact he'd apparently known but never publicly acknowledged during his lifetime. Green's story is a strange combination of professional collapse and a hidden personal life that only became public once he was no longer around to explain any of it himself. A man who had once decided the fate of countless amateur performers on live television, dying largely forgotten by an industry he'd helped build. Number 5. Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr was one of the most explosive and unpredictable comedians British television ever put on air, a regular fixture on variety shows and his own vehicles, through the 1970s and 80s, whose live performances were genuinely unlike anything else on the schedule at the time. His financial situation, however, was consistently precarious behind the scenes, and reports of significant unpaid tax bills followed him for years, culminating in a formal bankruptcy declaration in 2013, tied to debts reportedly running into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. His career had already been slowing considerably by that point, as his particular brand of unpredictable, high-energy comedy grew increasingly difficult to book on a television landscape that had shifted dramatically since his peak years. In 2012, he was arrested and questioned as part of a wider investigation into historical allegations, for which he was never charged, but the process itself further damaged bookings and public standing during a period when his finances were already collapsing. He spent his final years living relatively quietly, his health declining steadily, and he died in 2019. Starr's story is one of the clearer examples on this list of how a performer can go from commanding some of the biggest audiences on British television to a fairly quiet, financially strained final decade almost entirely out of the public eye. Number 4. Sid James. Sid James was one of the most beloved faces of the Carry On films and a genuine television star through various sitcom roles in the 1960s and 70s. His distinctive laugh and comic timing making him one of the most recognizable performers in British entertainment for close to 2 decades. Behind that public warmth, James had a serious and largely unmanaged gambling addiction that steadily drained a considerable fortune over the course of his career, reportedly losing significant sums at the racetrack and card tables on a fairly regular basis throughout his working life. The industry around him, much like with other performers on this list, had no real mechanism or interest in intervening as long as he kept showing up and delivering the performances audiences expected from him. In April 1976, James suffered a fatal heart attack while performing live on stage in Sunderland, collapsing in front of a full audience during a performance. A genuinely shocking way for one of the country's most familiar comic actors to die. He left behind far less in the way of actual savings than his decades of consistent, high-profile work would suggest he should have accumulated, the gambling having quietly eaten away at his finances in the background the entire time audiences were watching him make an entire nation laugh. Number 3. Charles Hawtrey. Charles Hawtrey appeared in more Carry On films than almost any other member of the regular cast, his particular brand of fey, high-pitched comic delivery becoming one of the defining voices of British comedy through the 1960s and early 70s. As the Carry On series wound down and his particular style of comedy fell increasingly out of fashion, Hawtrey found himself almost entirely unable to secure new work, and he retreated to the seaside town of Deal in Kent, where he lived a genuinely isolated existence for the rest of his life. His alcoholism, which had been an issue for years, worsened considerably during this period, and he became known locally more for erratic, sometimes hostile behavior than for the considerable comic talent that had once made him a household name. In 1984, a serious fire broke out at his home, believed to have started from a cigarette while he was drinking, and while he survived, the incident left him with lasting injuries and further isolated him from what little social connection he had left. He died in 1988, having spent his final years in near total obscurity relative to his earlier fame, largely estranged from most of his former carry-on colleagues, and reportedly cared for in his last days primarily by concerned neighbors, rather than anyone connected to the industry that had made him famous. Number 2. Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas was one of the most instantly recognizable comic actors in British film and television through the 1950s and 60s, his gap-toothed grin and exaggerated upper-class persona making him a genuine international star with a level of American film work that most British comedians of his era never came close to matching. In the early 1970s, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and the condition progressed steadily over the following 2 decades, gradually making it impossible for him to continue the kind of physical comic performances that had defined his entire career. As the work dried up alongside his declining health, his finances deteriorated just as steadily, and by the 1980s he was living in genuinely reduced circumstances, first in Ibiza and later back in England in a considerably more modest situation than his earlier fame would suggest. In 1989, the scale of his financial hardship became public knowledge, and the British entertainment industry organized a benefit performance, with fellow actors and comedians rallying to raise funds specifically to support him through his final years. It was a genuinely rare moment of the industry actively stepping in to help one of its own, rather than simply letting a former star fade into obscurity unnoticed. Terry Thomas died in January 1990, and while the benefit had eased his final months considerably, his story remains a stark example of how quickly even genuine international stardom can evaporate once illness removes your ability to keep working. Number 1. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock was, for a significant stretch of the late 1950s and early 60s, arguably the single biggest comedy star in Britain. His radio and television program Hancock's Half Hour regularly pulling in audiences that made him one of the most powerful and highly paid performers the BBC had. At the height of his fame, Hancock made a series of decisions that would systematically dismantle almost everything he'd built. He fell out repeatedly with writers and collaborators who had been central to his success, including a permanent split from his longtime scriptwriters that many biographers point to as the beginning of a steady creative decline he never fully recovered from. His alcoholism, already a significant problem during his peak years, worsened considerably as the quality and reliability of his work declined, and bookings that had once been guaranteed became increasingly difficult to secure. He moved to Australia in the late 1960s in an attempt to revive his career with a new television series, a move that ultimately failed to deliver the comeback he needed. In June 1968, while in Sydney, Hancock took his own life, leaving behind a note that reportedly read simply that things had seemed too much for him. He was found by a colleague having spent his final years watching a career that had once made him one of the most powerful men in British broadcasting collapse almost entirely under the weight of his own choices. A genuinely tragic end for someone who, at his absolute peak, had very little standing between him and total creative control of British comedy. 20 careers, 20 different roads to the same basic ending, an industry that gave enormous fame and remarkably little protection once that fame started to fade. Some of these people lost their money, some lost their health, a few lost their lives, and almost all of them lost the version of themselves that the country thought it knew. If you want more deep dives into the real stories behind the household names of classic British television, go ahead and subscribe. There's plenty more of this coming your way.